Chumash Bamidbar has a very interesting title. So in Hebrew, the word Bamidbar means a desert. In English, it's the Book of Numbers. Where does the source of the word, the Book of Numbers, come from? The rabbis called the book of Bamidbar Chumash HaPikudim. Pikudim loosely means numbers. The word Vayifkaid often means to count, although we'll soon see it means a lot more things. So before we go into the word Pikudim, what exactly the word means, and why the Chumash is called Chumash HaPikudim, the Book of Numbers, try to briefly summarize this week's Parsha, along with roughly an outline. What does Chumash Bamidbar speak about? What are the topics discussed in Chumash Bamidbar? So, the Book of Numbers, you think it's all about numbers. Now, the truth is there are some numbers. The Jewish people are counted twice in Chumash Bamidbar, once in Parshas Bamidbar and once at the end of the Sefer. And there's a lot of numbers with regard to the coordination of logistics when they moved through the desert. That includes some numbers. That's largely the numbers that are in the book. In this week's parsha itself, we find the counting initially, then we find some of the details of how exactly they traveled through the desert, and that comprises the vast majority of this week's parsha. Trying to look at Bamidbar in broad strokes, I think there are four themes that almost everything falls into. Theme number one is, if you look through Chumash Vayikra, so the Hebrew name Vayikra is a very interesting title. The word Vayikra means to call, right? Vayikra Hashem al Moshe. That's where the word comes from. The non-Jewish name, called the Book of Leviticus, Levitii, it comes from the rabbinical name of the book, which is Torah's Kahanim, the laws of Kahanim, which loosely translate as Leviticus, and that is the subject of the book of Vayikra. The subject of Vayikra is, how do you run a temple? How do you run a Mishkan? It's largely the focus of the entire book of Vayikra. But Bamidbar continues that theme. So you have the Beis HaMikdash, you have the Mishkan, you have a tabernacle. Now, how do you use it? And a lot of Chumash Vayikra is the consecration and the initiation of the tabernacle, or the Beis HaMikdash, the temple, and a lot of the different components. So, for example, this week's parsha, we talk about the consecration of the Leviim. We talk about next week's parsha, we talk about the initiation of the Nesiim, which was 12 days. Each one brought a bunch of sacrifices. We talk about Birchas Kahanim, the priestly blessings, Pesach Sheni, the second Karban Pesach, Parah Aduma, the red heifer, Saita, a woman who's a suspected adulterer, Nazir, which is largely a component of the temple process, temple offerings. The process of assembling, disassembling, and traveling with the Mishkan. And the Ramban notes that a lot of these discussions are specifically pertaining to the beginning of the Beis HaMikdash. There are not many commandments in Chumash Bamidbar. Most of the commandments were commandments that were given to the Jews in the desert that were never repeated again. Obviously, there are some that are, like a lot of the sacrifices for the Moedim, for the holidays, are mentioned in Parshas Pinchas. The second part of Bamidbar, which is probably the part that's, ignobly infamous, which is the Jewish people's sins and the tragedies. There's an unbelievable amount of sin in Chumash Bamidbar. First, they complained twice about the food. Once when they got the slav, the other time when they had to hang up the copper snake, the Nechash and Choshes. They sent the spies. That was the Meraglim, and the catastrophe that happened after that, and the sin of the Jewish people with the daughters of Moab, which was also a disaster, also brought a tremendous amount of pain and loss of life. You have Miriam criticizing Moshe for separating from his wife. She's punished with tzaras. And following the death of Miriam, what happens? One of the greatest tragedies. Moshe, there's no water. People complain again. Third complaint in Chumash Bamidbar. And Moshe Rabbeinu makes a big mistake, and he hits the rock instead of speaking to it. And that results in him not being able to enter into Eretz Yisrael. You also have the story of Korach, the fight between Korach and Moshe, the Korach rebellion, together with Dasan, Aviram, and many, many Jews. And you have the death of Aaron. Aaron passes away in Chumash Bamidbar, as well as a Shabbos desecrator who's put to death. And that is the tragedy and the sin of Chumash Bamidbar. On the third note, you do have quite a few miracles. You have the miracle of Balak hires Bilam, a known sorcerer, to curse the Jewish people. Bilam fails. That is a miracle. God appears to Bilam, and Bilam is only able to bless the Jewish people. He's not able to curse them. there are four major victories that the Jewish people have. One is against the daughters of against Midian for sending their daughters to seduce the men. Another three are against Amalek, Bashan, and the Amori. Those are relatively brief. You also have the miracle of Aaron. So after the conclusion of the Korach rebellion, all the heads of tribes take a staff. They put their staff in the holies of holies, and one of them starts blossoming, and that's the staff of Aaron. Those are the miracles of Chumash Bamidbar. And the fourth is a lot of logistics. How exactly they travel through the desert, and as you imagine, they're getting close to the Holy Land. It's time to prepare to enter into the Holy Land. And we have a lot of preparation in Chumash Bamidbar. So for example, you have extensive details, where they traveled, how they traveled, who went together as groups, in what order, how were things assembled, what was the logistical plan of traveling. That's covered extensively in many of the different parshas. You also get to preparing to enter the land, inheritance. What happens if somebody only has daughters, right? The daughters of Tzalofchad, famous story. You also have the law of the tithes, Trumas and Meisters. A lot of that is mentioned at the end of Parshas Korach. And you have the cities of refuge. Somebody kills by accident. He goes to a city of refuge, Ari Miklot, and the 42 cities that were designated for the Levium and how to build those cities. All of that is in Chumash Bamidbar. And finally, on the same theme, we have Reuven and Gad take their portion of the land on the other side of the river. So the four themes, just briefly to summarize, of Chumash Bamidbar are, number one, the consecration and the initiation of the Mishkan, and associated many of the different components that you need to do to be able to run a Mishkan, or run a Beis HaMikdash, tabernacle or temple. Number two is, unfortunately, this is probably the bulk of Bamidbar, is sins and tragedy. We said Jewish people sin tremendously in Chumash Bamidbar, more than any of the other books. And third, you have a couple of great miracles. And fourth, we have the details of the travels and the preparation to enter the land of Israel. Those are the four themes. As you notice, there are some numbers, but not a terribly large amount of numbers. Okay, now the title Bamidbar sort of makes sense, right? Bamidbar means what happened in the desert, and this book really is what happened in the desert. It's the unfortunate sins, it's some of the miracles, and it talks about how to basically consecrate a temple, how to initiate the process of having a Mishkan, and that's really about what Midbar life was. What was life during the 40 years in the desert? That is described in Chumash Bamidbar. And the preparation to go into the land. That's sort of intuitive. But the other book, the title of the book of Numbers, Chumash HaPikudim. Good evening. The title of the book of Numbers. Why is it called the book of Numbers? There are some numbers, maybe even a fair amount of numbers. But by and large, Bamidbar is not about numbers. And like we pointed out, the title of the book of Numbers is rabbinical in nature. The rabbis called Chumash Bamidbar the book of Numbers, Chumash HaPikudim. So I want to try to explore this a little bit, specifically as it pertains to this week's Parsha, and then more collectively as it pertains to the entire Chumash of Bamidbar. What's the first thing that happens in Chumash Bamidbar? God speaks to Moshe in the Midbar, why the name of the book is called Bamidbar, in the Oyel Moed, in the tent of meeting, on the second month, on the first day of the second month that they left Egypt. One second. Okay. If you can't hear me, just unpause. Okay. So he tells Moshe on the first day of the second month. The second month is Iyar, first day of Iyar. Okay. So it's 1 year after they leave Mitzrayim. He tells Moshe in the desert, inside the tent of meeting. And what does he tell him? Make a census. Go count everybody. Rav Hirsch, when he tries to describe the book of Bamidbar, he says it's a book about nationality and community, which is true. It's precisely what it is. It's a book about the nation acting together, sometimes acting, separately, each one going on their own way. There's this internal strife that pops up every now and then. And the idea of a census which happens both at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book. The end of the book, it happens the 39th year after leaving Egypt. So it's right before they go to Israel. And this one, the first counting in the book, is sort of a year into the desert. So you sort of have the counting at the beginning and the counting at the end. This reflects the nationality, the community of Klal Yisrael, of the Jewish people. The purpose of the census, as he notes, was not for political or economical reasons. There were no politics, as it were, or at least interpolitical rivalries, that would require a census that occurred during the desert. They were in the wilderness. There was no need to reallocate House of Delegates to different components of the community. They weren't in a permanent land. There was no need to have that sort of governmental structure. They were constantly on the move. And there were no economical reasons because all their economical needs were provided by God. The purpose of the census was to establish them as a people, but as God's people. This already is noted by Rashi. Rashi points out this is the third time that they're being counted in 1 year. So the Jewish people are counted as they leave Egypt. 600,000 people are counted. That happens immediately. They're counted twice more in the same year. In one 14-month period, it's actually 4 countings. Once when they leave Egypt, they're counted as 600,000. They're counted after the sin of the golden calf, right? You figure they sin with the golden calf on Tisha B'Av, right? Which would mean that they're counted sometime after Tisha B'Av. They're counted again. And this is 3 times actually. This time coincides also with the beginning of the construction of the Mishkan. So they construct the Mishkan and they donate each a coin, so they're counted then. And then they're counted again almost a year, 3/4 of a year later, after the Mishkan is constructed. And the commandment is said ba'oihel mayed. Most of the time, God doesn't tell us where he's talking to Moshe. It just says, Vaydavar Hashem Moshe Lemar. Presumably it was in the Ohel Moed, because it says that God spoke to Moshe from on top of the Kruvim. The cherubs were in the Ohel Moed, in the tabernacle, the Mishkan. So we know where it was, but it doesn't specify it. Over here, this command of the census, it specifically says where he told it to Moshe, in the Ohel Moed, because that's what it was really about. When you have something that's valuable and precious, you're constantly looking after it and counting it. You want to make sure you have every single one. And this counting, Rashi points out, was a counting that was out of love. The Gur Aryeh, which is a commentary on Rashi, notes a very interesting thing. He notes that Rashi connects this. Rashi makes this argument because of the fact that the Torah has to tell you the date of when it happened. And he says this is precisely the point. It's very important to know the date, because the date tells us this is the third count of the year, of a 13-month period. So that's a clear indication that this is God looking after his people, making sure that every single thing is there. Like a person who's counting cash in the bank, making sure he has everything that he wants. It shows a certain desire and a closeness. And now that we understand that the book of Bamidbar is about the nationality of the people, the community of the people, and again, this is through the strife, through the discord, through the process of building a Beis Hamikdash and a temple, through the miracles, and obviously through the preparation to enter into the land, which will be a land of our nation. And of course, it's also about the connection between Hashem and us. Hashem is constantly looking after us and making sure he always counts us. And I think with this, we could try to explain exactly the concept of Chumash HaPikudim, the book of Numbers. The word Bamidbar means a desert. Obviously, the book relates to, on a simple level, Bamidbar is the book that tells us what happened in the desert. And that's a fairly accurate description. However, the word Bamidbar can also be read as Midaber. Midbar is mem with the word daber. Daber means to speak, of course. Mem is always a removing. When you put a mem before a letter, it removes it from the category, which means, in a certain sense, that the book of Bamidbar is when you come out of speech. You remove yourself from speech. I'll explain that. From. So, right. So, Midaber would be from speech as in away from speech. I'll try to explain this for a moment. When you look at the sea, when you talk about navigation, on the land, navigation is typically measured, and there's direction to it. There's right, left, forward, backwards, and you travel to a certain waypoint, a landmark, and you make a turn at the landmark. You're navigated through landmarks in different directions, pertaining to your orientation of the journey. Before the days of GPS, when you travel, and even today in a certain sense, when you're in the ocean, there are no landmarks. As a matter of fact, without a compass, direction is pretty much meaningless. The proper orientation is there is no orientation. It's really breadth. It's how far are you from me? It's only when you have multiple landmarks where you can start pointing, oh, this is to my left, this is to my right. In the sea, there's no left and right. There's no sort of direction go to point A, then travel, turn left to point B. Because there are no point A and point B. The sea is an empty place. It's a place where there is no direction. There's no navigation. The navigation is sort of front and back is really the only way you can describe it. It's always a measurement of distance. How close are you to me and how far are you from me? When you're in a sea without a compass, without a GPS. I had a friend who he was on a jet ski in Florida on Key West, and all of a sudden he lost his way. He's in the Gulf of Mexico. There's no clue where he is. No compass, no GPS, no phone. Yeah, and he had to stop his jet ski and figure out how exactly is he going to figure out where he is. He found his way back, but it's a challenge. You don't have a GPS, you don't have a compass. It's really all about breadth. There's no landmarks. There's no way to figure out where you are.
What about the stars?
So at night, that's already a compass, sort of the same thing as a compass. So the stars, you can sort of align yourself and figure out which direction, roughly speaking, you're headed. How many degrees have you traveled, and that is possible. With using the stars, you can figure the stars can sort of line in with in place of a compass. So that is true. It is possible to navigate, and that's how it was done back in the day. But when you talk about a sea, you talk about breadth. When you talk about a land, you talk about landmarks and distance. The desert is the sea of the land, in that sense, because the desert as well has no landmarks, and it's all the same. You look out, and it's just, and again, like the caravans of yore, they would travel by looking at the stars and by counting how things have changed in numbers of degrees based on the amount of distance they traveled. And in a certain sense, Bamidbar is a place where it's desolate. It's a place where either we'll be close or we will be far. But there's no landmarks to figure out exactly where we're going to be headed to. Let's take this a little further. Pakad, to remember. Pakad means a few things. It means to count, but it also means to remember. And it also means to redeem. Right? Yosef tells the brothers, don't forget me. Right? And he tells them that God won't forget, God will redeem you. Hashem pakad yifkad elkim eschem. God will redeem me. God will redeem you. And he promises the brothers that they should remember him and take his body out of Egypt. So the word pakad has a number of different meanings. Another meaning of pakad also means intimacy. Right? Chayav adam lifkad es ishta b'shashu yaitz l'derach. So the word pakad is sort of a process. It means to count, which is to be notable, to be remembered. That's what it means to count. And to be remembered is to be redeemed, to have your life recognized as something that's worth. And the process also brings to intimacy, to closeness. And sort of the idea of the Chumash Bamidbar is the Chumash HaPikudim. It's a process that we remove from a midbar, from a desert, to Pikudim, to being remembered for who we are, to a process of closeness and love with Hashem. You talk about Hashem remembering the time in the desert. So he tells Yirmiyah, he says, warn the people of the sins. And then he says, I remember, I accounted to your favor the devotion of your youth. To go after me in the desert. We went into a place, this is really the story of Chumash Bamidbar. It's about, are we close to Hashem or are we far from him? And will we draw closer to him? The Chumash is a Chumash of Bamidbar. It takes place in a desert. It's filled with sin and desolation. But ultimately, where we want to get to is a Chumash HaPikudim, a Chumash where we're remembered and we're drawn close to Hashem, a Chumash where we're intimate with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with God. Finally, one last minute. The word Bamidbar is the same numerical value as Avraham, which is exactly a parallel to Avraham's life. Avraham is born into a world that's full of idol worship. It's a desert. It's Bamidbar. It's desolate. Nobody remembers God. And the first thing Avraham Avinu does is he remembers God. He says, oh, there is a God. There's a creator. And then he finds redemption in the world because there is a creator. He's pakad. And finally, God calls Avraham Avinu his beloved, Avraham Oyavi. He has an intimacy. He has a pekida with Hashem, with God. And obviously to end with, we can say that, Bamidbar is not just about the Jewish people's lives way back when. Obviously, Bamidbar is about all of our lives. All of our lives could take place in a desert, where the way we can orient ourselves to God is how close are we or how far are we? And the real process here is to move to Pekida, first remembering that God is here. And then at Pekida, God will redeem us. We'll find meaning in what we're doing. And finally, to Pekida, to a closeness and intimacy with God. Thank you for listening.